grateful to be with you this morning. We gather together in the sound of God's words. Pray for His help. Come to explain God's words that has read. Father, whether we are here virtually or here in person, our longing is that we would be here spiritually, that we might hear from you, the living God. Thank you that your voice rings out. It is clear. Help me as I speak to not get in the way of that. Pray that you would speak clearly, not just to our minds, but through our minds to our hearts, so that our lives will be changed. For Jesus' name's sake. Amen. It's pretty clear today, isn't it, that Jesus is on trial in the courts of popular opinion. All sorts of things: historically unreliable, culturally outdated, spiritually exclusive, and a whole bunch of other things as well. He is on trial. There are people all around the world who are sitting in judgment over him, interrogating him, offering evidence supposedly to guide themselves and other people to one or other verdict on him. Maybe you would admit this morning that you have Jesus on trial at the moment in some or other way. Maybe he's on trial because you're not convinced by him yet. Maybe you've heard it said that science disproves chunks of a Christian story. Maybe you've read somewhere that supposedly the Gospels of accounts of Jesus contradict one another. So Jesus is in the dock for you who are examining the evidence. He is on trial to prove who he is, his identity as the Son of God or as the Messiah. Or maybe you would believe that he is the Son of God, but he's on trial in your book for whether he has kept his promises or not. Maybe Jesus for you is not showing up at the moment. On Wednesday at the prayer walk, I met a lady who has great faith. It was so encouraging meeting her, but it has been hard for her to not have her faith waver recently. So her daughter, 7 months ago, came down with long COVID to the point where she cannot get out of bed, where she cannot even speak without it exhausting her. She was a university student. She was a few months away from finishing her honors degree. And then she had her dream trip lined up where she was going to travel overseas and pursue her passion in musical theatre. All of that is on hold indefinitely. Sounds like a wonderful, faithful family, but it is hard in that situation, isn't it? Not to put Jesus on trial. There are people all over the world who are praying for family, for her daughter, but she could be found asking the question, why? Why my daughter? Why is she not showing signs of recovery when others are? Why, when she loves Jesus and she has so much to contribute, is she confined? Maybe you could relate to that at different levels as you look sideways to what others have, things that you long to have, and yet things that God has not given you. And that robs you of joy. Or maybe challenges that God has given you that you wish you didn't have and that others seem to be exempt from. Joy is hard to come by as you interrogate Jesus, as you put him on trial. Why? Or maybe Jesus is just on trial to the extent, as he is for all of us, in the myriad of big and small decisions, where we're left asking the question, is he worth it? Is he worth following? Is it worth paying the price of following him in this decision, in this situation, in this moment? To choose to deny myself the way that I would want to go, naturally, and to pick up my cross and follow him. Well, Jesus is used to being on trial. That's fair to say. We've seen it all the way through Mark's gospel. His opposition have been asking him questions to trap him. He hasn't fitted their profile of what they expected God to be and to do when he stepped into the earth. They've been plotting against him. His family and his disciples have been obtuse, annoyingly slow to understand, judging him, telling Jesus what he can and cannot do. used to being on trial. But this passage takes it to a whole other level, because we enter literally the court in the trials of Jesus that would signal the end of his life. He's been arrested, and now he faces a series of trials. And when you put together all of the evidence of the different Gospels, it seems that there are 5 trials. Mark condenses them into 2. A trial before the Jews, the Jewish leadership, and in particular, Caiaphas, the high priest. That's in verse 53 to 65. And then a trial before the Romans, in particular, the governor, Pontius Pilate, in chapter 15, verse 1 to 15. Is Mark being lazy? Is he distorting the facts by just recording the 2 trials? No. He is deliberately quoting eyewitness testimony against Jesus and the words of Jesus so that we truly see Jesus. Mark has an agenda, unashamed. Why the 2 different trials? Well, the short answer is that under the law, Jews were not allowed to execute those that they found guilty according to their own judgments. So Rome had to be brought on board. They had the powers of execution. They had to be convinced of this person's guilt, and therefore there needed to be a translation of the charges from the things that concern the Jews, namely blasphemy, which the Romans were not bothered by, into something that the Romans would be bothered by, something political, something seditious, something rebellious or treasonous, according to the rules of the Roman Empire. Those are the 2 trials that Mark zooms in on, and as Mark does that, we are going to see in the clearest terms exactly who Jesus is. As clear as it has ever been so far in Mark's gospel, this is the moment. And we will see that he is the suffering servant, and that he is God's eternal king, and that those 2 are inextricably linked. They are not divisible. Firstly, there's a culpable conspiracy, and we've kind of seen this boiling all the way through Mark's gospel since chapter 3 and verse 6. But what is evident in the trials is that there is a united conspiracy against Jesus. There's unity, verse 53, and they led Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together. Verse 55, now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against him to put him to death. The council there is the Sanhedrin. It's the ruling group of 70 elders, 70 men, who were the highest ruling authority amongst the Jews. And so Jesus is standing there before the united leadership of Israel. It was kind of like standing in front of Parliament and the Supreme Court all at the same time. They are united against him. But it is a united conspiracy, because their aim clearly is not to establish the facts of the case. They're not interested in those. They have a clear agenda, which is that they were seeking testimony, we're told, against Jesus. They weren't seeking testimony and evidence of all kinds. Their desired outcome was not the truth about Jesus, but the death of Jesus. So that even when they find no credible testimony, they press on regardless. Verse 56. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. Yet even about this, their testimony did not agree. That's the problem with a lie, is that when it has to be told by a number of different people, they will end up contradicting one another. It's exactly what happens. And the only evidence that Mark specifically mentions here is also a lie or a distortion. Verse 58, we heard him say, we'll destroy the temple. I will destroy this temple that is made with hands and rebuild another, not made with hands. That would on face value be something that would be worthy of attention of a Jewish court, something threatening arson against the most important building around. But again, that is a distortion. And the reason, verse 59, they couldn't even agree about what Jesus had said is that they didn't understand what Jesus had said. Jesus was not referring to the physical building of the temple, believing that he was going to send a missile through this. No, he was speaking about his own body, his temple, the dwelling place of God with man. So the high priest has to ask Jesus in the midst of what verse 60 is highly amusing, and it wasn't so tragic. The high priest, in the midst of all this contradictory testimony, they're saying these things. It's like, well, what exactly are these men saying against you, Jesus? It's effectively what it's saying. That they can't seem to agree. Do you not have anything to say about what these men are saying? Could you maybe please clarify these charges against you so that we can condemn you on? Well, in the trial before Pilate, the same reality is evidence. Pilate, failing to identify any guilt in Jesus, he offers to the crowd in verse 9 to release Jesus because, verse 10, he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. Pilate has been around the political bloc, and he knows that the Jewish leaders have hidden the agenda. Verse 11, Mark tells us it was the chief priests who stirred up the crowds against Jesus to demand his crucifixion. And Pilate says, why? What evil has been done? So they have nothing with which to condemn Jesus. They can't agree. The charges won't stick. The conspiracy, all of the Jews together, and then roping in Pilate. The case should have been thrown. But then the chief priest turns to Jesus himself. And I want us to drill down into the two reactions of Jesus that we see. First, that he is silent to the slaughter. Secondly, that he is consciously the king, silent to the slaughter. The high priest Caiaphas asked in verse 60, have you no answer to make? Have you no answer to the charges that these men are bringing about you? What we know are trumped up charges for false and contradictory testimony. But what Mark wants us to see is that Jesus is absolutely quiet. Verse 61, he remained silent and he made no answer. Same when Jesus is in front of Pilate, chapter 15, verse 3. And the chief priests in front of Pilate accused Jesus of many things. And Pilate again asked him, have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you. But Jesus made no further answer. And so Pilate was amazed. That the high priest wants Jesus to speak so that by Jesus' words he will incriminate and condemn himself. Pilate, on the other hand, he finds no guilt in Jesus. He wants him to speak because his inclination is to set him free, and he wants Jesus to say things that are going to give him a leg to stand on in front of the crowds. And disturbing to both Caiaphas and Pilate, Jesus remains silent. He refuses to defend himself. We have to ask why. Why, when every human instinct rails against innocent suffering and the injustice, and why, when every instinct for self-preservation and self-defense is a reality? Why is it that Jesus remains silent? Writer of Ecclesiastes in chapter 3 says there is a time to keep silence, and there is a time to speak. And it can be excruciatingly hard, I'm sure this is your experience, to know when is the right time to do which of those. Right? When is it the time that I should be silent and not feel the need to stand up and defend myself? When is the right time to speak out against something that is wrong? And you would think that this would be the time for Jesus to speak up when it is a matter of life and death, when his character is being assassinated by these lies, and when his physical life is on the line. He's about to be unjustly executed. How hard would it have been to be silent? But he doesn't speak. And he doesn't speak for two reasons. Firstly, because his innocence was not ultimately at stake. The world now knows, for those who have eyes to see, what Mark is portraying for us, that he is innocent. These are trumped up charges, that there is a culpable conspiracy against him. And even if he had protested, the culpable conspiracy would have done away with him anyway, in their rabid desire to do so. They have, paradoxically, as far as the reader is concerned, as much as they try to condemn Jesus, they end up condemning themselves. Trumped up charges, false witnesses, bypassing the Jewish legal system. I read something online this week by kind of a legal journal, looking into the procedure and how they had utterly butchered their own procedure, like in terms of not being allowed to have a trial at night, not asking questions that would incriminate the witness, etc., etc. So there's about 7 where they have railroaded their own legal system in order to get away with Jesus' murder. So Jesus' innocence was not ultimately at stake. And secondly, though, although his life was at stake, it was meant to be so. We know that from our journey through Mark's Gospel. Jesus' ambition was not to escape the cross. He predicted the cross. He explained the significance of the cross, the ransom, the Passover lamb, the cup of God's wrath. And he is prepared to go the way of the cross. He stops Peter from intervening with his sword in the Garden of Gethsemane. All because it was the way it was intended to be, or because it was what was prophesied. Because Isaiah prophesied that the Lamb would be silent. Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 7. I think I put it there on the sheets. This is Isaiah's prophecy of the suffering servant, the one who would come to save God's people. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that is before its shearer is silent, so he opened not his mouth. The suffering servant, there's some servant songs in Isaiah, and Isaiah 53 is the culmination of this painting of the suffering servant. And Mark has been demonstrating to us all the way through how all of the elements, the essential elements of that painting of the suffering servant have been fulfilled in the happenings around. So I'll summarize it there for you in a table on your sheets. I'd love you to chase those through, even just read Isaiah chapter 53 and reflect on it and know that Mark has shown us that every detail is being fulfilled. He is the one who came to suffer innocently at the hand of God in the place of sinners to rescue them from sin. He is the one who was prophesied. He is going silently to the slaughter as demonstration that he is the suffering servant. But as the writer of Ecclesiastes wrote, there's a time to keep silence, there is also a time to speak. So Jesus did not remain silent throughout the trial. There is one line of questioning to which Jesus does respond. And he does so both in front of Caiaphas and in front of Pilate, which is that he, in our next point, is consciously the king. Even as he is the suffering servant, he is consciously the king. Verse 61, Jesus remained silent and made no answer. Again, the high priest answered him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Christ meaning the Messiah, the King sent by God to judge and to rescue. Are you Christ? Are you the Son of God, the Son of the Blessed? And so for Jesus at that point to say yes, well, that would have been blasphemy. That would have been enough to condemn him. Jesus answered, verse 62, I am. I am is, I think there's more than a hint there of Jesus claiming for himself the name of the Old Testament God, Yahweh, translated as I am who I am. And so it's a composite. Jesus, even just in saying I am, saying I am who you just said, I am the Christ, the Son of the Blessed. That's enough to condemn me. And I am Yahweh. It's enough to send the high priest apoplectic. But Jesus takes it even further than that. In the remainder of verse 62, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated on the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Jesus is taking words from Psalm 110 and words from Daniel chapter 7, and he is putting them together in this overwhelming, swashbuckling composite of who he is. Not only is he the Christ, the Son of the Blessed, but he is also the one who is at the right hand of God, the ruling hand of God, who is almighty and cannot be stood against. And he will return on the clouds to bring the Father's judgment on all who stand against him. See what Jesus is doing in that moment where he looks the furthest thing from that. He says, this in reality is who I am. You see the suffering servant, but I am the eternal king who has dominion over everyone and everything, and to whom everyone will give account. So you can see why they react in the way that they do in verse 63 and 64. I'm tired. I'm sure you're tired, if you're a believer, of people saying that Jesus never claimed to be God. it's really clear what Caiaphas understood Jesus to be claiming about himself. Apoplectic, he tears his garments because that's what the high priest has to do when he hears blasphemous words uttered in his presence, and says, "What further witnesses do we need? You have heard this blasphemy." Jesus is consciously the king, and even in front of Pilate, remember that the charges had to be translated from spiritual to political charges. Pilate says to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "You have said so." It's the only thing he answers to. You have said so. The trials I see on TV, there's often a debate that goes on, law and order type things, or these cases that you track in these documentaries. And the question centers around, is it a wise tactic on the part of the defense team to get the defendants to testify? That's all it seems to be from the US legal system, right? Because the question is, they can stand up and say one thing, but then they're going to be cross-examined by the prosecution. And they have a habit of picking holes in your case. And actually, you end up hindering your chances more than helping. They'll work you into a corner and make you look bad. Well, it's notable that Jesus has no defense attorney, no witnesses to call to his side. They've all scattered. We're told that Peter is hiding in the courtyard. And we talked about how the whole legal system, Jewish legal system, had been contributed. But in such a case, is it wise to put yourself on the stand? And it comes down to this. I think Jesus, if he had a defense lawyer there, well, that guy would have been pulling his hair out. Because Jesus is shooting himself in both feet. In the area where the defense lawyer would want him to speak up and say, these are trumped up charges. It's evident to everybody here that these people are fabricating it. They can't even agree amongst themselves. Speak up, Jesus. And Jesus remains silent. And on the point and the question where if Jesus says anything, he is going to incriminate himself and send himself straight to the cross, that is the point where Jesus chooses to speak. You have to ask yourself why. The answer is that Jesus is deliberately choosing the charge on which he will be condemned. He wants everybody there and the world to know, down to this day, precisely why it is that he was going to the cross. He is going to the cross not in spite of him being the king, but precisely because he is the king. It is the king's cross that he is going to. See, I wonder if the reason why we put Jesus on trial, as we're all prone to, is because we haven't really seen with clarity this truth of precisely who he is. As he is on trial, as he's been examined, all these questions answered, the shining forth of who he really is. He is the innocent suffering servant who was also the eternal king. And he had to be both at the same time. That is who we worship. And that to follow the king who is on the cross involves following something of his pattern. Something of the pattern of the suffering now, which is evidently here in this passage, but also verse 62, the vindication, as he will return and be seen to be exactly who he is. There is a pattern that he has established, that if we don't see him clearly, we will struggle ourselves to follow and we will put him on trial. We'll be forgetting that our vindication is coming, precisely because he didn't shy away from this. When we do put Jesus on trial, it puts us in the majority. The suffering king, the king on the cross, has always been rejected by the world. Mark makes that clear. We only have time to do a bit of a flyover of that in this passage. The summary is there on your sheets. He was rejected by old Israel. He was denied by new Israel, the disciples. He is condemned by the whole world. We've already looked at old Israel, the high priest, and the Sanhedrin, the opposition so far in Mark's gospel. In terms of new Israel, the disciples, well, this is the moment of Peter's denial. You notice how Mark deliberately inserts verse 53. He starts talking about Jesus on trial. Verse 55 is talking about Jesus on trial. But then he inserts verse 54 to indicate that Peter is about to undergo his own trial. That gets expanded on from verse 66 onwards. And facing Peter, the contrast between Jesus and Peter is there deliberately. And probably the biggest contrast is exactly who is putting them on trial. Jesus is facing the weight of the Jewish establishment and the Roman Empire. Peter is facing a servant girl who asks the question, weren't you with him? And as Peter denies, things just spiral. Questions get more pointed. Peter's objections get more vehement, to the point in verse 71 where he swears on his life. It's one of the saddest parts of Scripture. I do not know this man of whom you speak. Remember Jesus' words in chapter 8, verse 38? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he returns in his Father's glory. Throughout the disciple journey through the gospel, the disciples have been obtuse. They've been slow to understand. They've had Jesus on trial, but this is where it comes to. The rooster crows, Jesus' prediction comes true in precise detail. And Peter breaks down. So here is the brokenness of Peter. Actually, the point that we all need to get to, the point where we realize that he needs to be on trial, because as we face any kind of trial for faithfulness, we are in the same crowd as Peter. We are those who are ultimately denied. We are those who are ashamed of him, his words of this adulterous and sinful generation. So that we see ourselves and we see Jesus and the contrast between the two. We are drawn to faithful following of him. Because we are lumped together with the whole world. We are with Peter. We are with the whole world. It seems that Pilate, there was a tradition of being Pilate, I guess, to curry favor, would have been allowed to release a prisoner to the Jews. And they invoke this provision. And Pilate wants to, because he sees no guilt in Jesus, wants to release Jesus, and he offers him, and the crowd instead asks for Barabbas. And they instead cry out for Jesus to be crucified. Why does Mark include Barabbas here? Some people argue that Barabbas is a picture of substitution. So Jesus dies so that Barabbas, the criminal, the real criminal, is set free, and we are all real criminals, we are all guilty, and Jesus has died in our place. And there may be some of that, but Mark's already made that point, that Jesus is dying as a substitute, he's dying as a ransom, drinking the cup in our place. He is the Passover lamb who dies, who bleeds and dies instead of us. He's already made that point. I think we are not Barabbas who Jesus dies in place of. I think the point here is we are in the crowd, shouting together, we would rather that Jesus be crucified than a criminal set free. We are in the crowd crying, crucify him. All the more, all the louder, verse 14, crucify him. And so Pilate delivers him over. And Mark's point is clear, that the whole world, including you and me here today, are implicated in culpable conspiracy. As theologian Tom Wright put it, betrayed by one associate, forsaken by 10 more, and renounced by his closest friend, he stands alone, defenseless before the world. No one else can give their life as a ransom for men. So the question this morning is, what do we do with our tendency to put Jesus on trial, to scrutinize him? Yes, the prayer would be that God would give us a heart to be able to see, as we see the innocent suffering King, innocent and suffering servant, who is the eternal King on the cross for us, that we would see his beauty and his righteousness and the truth radiating through, that we would see that for ourselves. And I guess the prayer would also be that know that even as we examine him, so he is examining you. Jesus on trial, that is precisely the moment when we see him most clearly. But even so, he turns the tables on us, even as we put Jesus on trial. The fact of us putting him on trial shows something about us. Don't get me wrong, Jesus can take being put on trial. I said it earlier. It is right to interrogate the claims of Jesus. It is right to look into the evidence. That's precisely why these documents, the Gospels, were written. He welcomes that, and we as a church welcome it. It's a big part of what we are. We welcome doubt and skepticism. We want to create spaces to bring all of those, to engage our minds, but we need to know there comes a point. Blockage to acknowledging it's not an issue of the mind, but an issue of the heart. It's not a question of the intellect, but a moral question. It's not that I cannot see Jesus for who he is and acknowledge him for who he is, but that I will not. And so even as we put him on trial, and the truth of the beauty and the innocence and the righteousness of the innocence of the king strikes us, and we're ashamed of that, the call is to turn away from that. The judgment is not on him. The judgment is on us. It's like those who stand in front of a masterpiece of art, or who are listening to stunning pieces of music, and who judge it, and who spit on it, who deface it, who mock it, and who dismiss it. The judgment is not on the masterpiece, is it? The judgment is on the person who is dismissing it. And that's what verse 62 does. There is a turning of the tables. Jesus says, even as you stand in judgment over them, there is a time when the Son of Man, who is seated at the right of power, will come on the clouds of heaven. The tables will be turned. You have an invitation now to turn. To, as you put Jesus on trial, see him for who he is, and then see yourself in the light of that, and understand that even as yet finds you guilty and rebellious and in treason, that the Jesus you are looking at is not just the king who should rightly find you guilty. He is also the innocent, suffering servant who is offering you forgiveness and amnesty, even as you stand convicted. Even as you put him on trial, there is an invitation to come back to him. The high priest and the Roman governor ruled by greed. They were ruled by greed and fear. They believed that they were assigning Jesus to the scrap heap of history. Well, instead, despite all of their might, it is where they ended up. Within 3 years, Pilate was ordered to Rome to face charges of excessive cruelty, and he was exiled. In 1990, archaeologists found an ossuary, a bone box, a box of bones. I won't explain the whole story, you can Google this. But they found a box of bones in an unremarkable tomb in Jerusalem. And the inscriptions indicate that in all probability, these were the bones of Caiaphas, who died probably around the age of 60. Died in anonymity. They were assigned to the scrap. And Jesus stands where he is now. Verse 62 is going to come true. And so what do you do with all of those things that you want to prosecute Jesus with, put him on trial for? Your unmet expectations, your insecurity, the subtle or the unsubtle complaints of the things that God has given you don't want, not given you that you do want, cost of following. Well, do not level them at him. Do not level them at them. Bring them to him. He is the innocent suffering servant who can handle it. I think he has proven. You take a moment, private parts, just to reflect. Pray. We'll sing in response. Pilate delivered him to be crucified. Father, we are humbled as we stand before this Jesus, as we've been gazing into him, as we've been exploring him, as we've been interrogating him and looking at the evidence for him, listening to what was said about him, listening to what he said, listening to the testimony of what he did. So, Father, my prayer is that we would see him clearly for who he is. That he is, even as he is the king, he is the one who suffers. And even as he is a suffering servant, he is the king who will return in glory. And so, Lord, where we put him on trial, where we're putting him on trial in our hearts right now, we pray that as we see him clearly, as we examine him, we would be true, we would be faithful, we would be balanced and fair and righteous in our examination. so that as we see him, he would melt our hearts. He is the one who hunger in our place, even as our